I think we can all agree that popular, high-budget, blockbuster cinema has, for a while now, been on a downwards trajectory. Despite all the staggering budgets and huge stars, despite all the different ways we can watch this stuff nowadays, something very fundamental seems to have gone missing. You know of what I speak. The heart, the soul, the passion. These elements that have defined epic storytelling from the Odyssey and Beowulf to Seven Samurai and Bridge on the River Kwai. Well, they're becoming harder and harder to find in the realm of cinema, lost in an ever-deepening sea of formulaic plots, rushed CGI, low-contrast, murky compositions, shot reverse shots on dull green screen backgrounds, drowning in intertextuality and references and cameos and quips and laziness. Nothing can be sincere anymore, nothing can be simply played straight. TV is now cinema, cinema is now TV. Art? That's now content. Hey, that piece of content did pretty well. Let's make a sequel, and 3 spin-offs. You know what? Just make it a cinematic universe. Sure, independent art house cinema is still great. In fact, it's probably better than it's ever been. I feel like most year-end best films of the year lists these days are consistently carried by companies such as A24, alongside the small select group of reliable auteurs who are actually given enough creative freedom to make something original and interesting. But sometimes I just want to watch a well-made blockbuster which respects itself, which respects its audience, which is actually trying really, really hard. On a completely unrelated note, I just got done watching the entire 4K remastered extended editions of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy in the cinema. I'm still not exactly sure why cinemas across the world decided to screen the Lord of the Rings extended editions back to back to back. I can't remember that ever happening before, but I'm not complaining. These are some of my favourite films of all time, and I of course leapt at the opportunity to watch what I consider to be the definitive versions of these 3 masterpieces in the theatre. And yes, the experience was incredible, obviously. However, sitting in the same cinema where I usually watch contemporary movies really got me comparing Lord of the Rings to every other epic blockbuster that comes out today. And I emerged from the cinema after finishing Return of the King with a few main questions. How on earth did they pull that off? And what the hell happened? How did we go from my brother, my captain, my king to somehow Palpatine returned? Well, I have a few ideas. Adaptations are always going to be difficult, okay? Literature, cinema, they're just such different storytelling mediums, each with their own strengths and limitations. Of course, a ton of challenges are going to arise. What do you include? What do you leave out? How do you best capture the essence and soul of the original work while converting it to the big screen? And sure, there will always be those die-hard Tolkien purists who were disappointed by some of the changes Peter Jackson and co. made to the original source material. Like, for example, the removal of Tom Bombadil, Glorfindel, and the entire scouring of the Shire, Frodo telling Sam to go home, the Witch King of Angmar breaking Gandalf's staff, as well as the character alterations to the likes of Gimli, Faramir, and Denethor, among others. However, I think that we can pretty much all agree that, for the most part, considering just how monumental and daunting of a task adapting Tolkien's original books is, especially when working within the constraints and expectations of a major studio, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy is incredibly respectful to what came before it. This becomes especially clear when watching the hours upon hours of behind-the-scenes footage from the trilogy, where you get to see just how much everyone loved and respected the source material, and just how committed they were to retaining the spirit of the books. I'll talk about this more later, but the crew's utter dedication and meticulous attention to detail is so evident when watching these movies. From the design of the costumes, to the construction of the sets, to the authenticity of the dialogue, you can just tell how much everyone who worked on these 3 movies were completely immersed in Tolkien's world, often reading the books on set and constantly consulting with Tolkien experts to ensure that they honoured the source material. There's this great quote from Peter Jackson, which I won't include here because I'll probably get a copyright claim, but basically he's discussing how he didn't want to insert his own baggage, his own politics into the trilogy, because The Lord of the Rings is not his story. It's Tolkien's. And I think that's such a good mindset to have when it comes to adaptation, when it comes to following and respecting what came before. It's incredibly refreshing to hear, especially in 2024, a strange time in cinema where it kind of feels like many of the people behind some of the biggest franchises don't even really like or respect the source material they're drawing from. And this is no more clear than in Star Wars, which I don't think is a franchise anyone on the internet has ever really spoken about before. But seriously, if I could attribute the failure of Disney's Star Wars to one thing, other than, you know, capitalism, the drive to make as much money as possible, over taking your time and actually making something good, it would be that they still do not seem to understand nor have any interest in figuring out what made those first few films so good in the first place. But not only this, it seems as if they don't even like or respect what came before, which is kind of bizarre when you say it out loud, but that's the situation we find ourselves in. It is not a coincidence that the only well-received Disney Star Wars products, being Andor, Rogue One, and the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian, are the only things which clearly respect and honour the original trilogy, while of course striking out and doing their own thing, you know, trying something new. And I think this nicely links into my next point, which involves one of the best attributes the Lord of the Rings trilogy has, and something which is mostly missing from modern blockbusters. When I first watched The Lord of the Rings, or for that matter, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, there would often be moments where, I'll be honest, I straight up cringed, okay? I didn't understand what the filmmakers were doing. It all felt a bit too camp and over-emotional for me. And it's funny looking back on it now, because I think what had happened is that I had just been so exposed to the post-ironic, cynical, self-aware storytelling which dominates cinema these days, that I did not recognize sincerity. Let's just take the ending of Fellowship, for example, when Frodo helps Sam onto the boat. I thought it was silly. I thought it was melodramatic. I was begging for someone to break the tension with some clever Joss Whedon quip. And looking back, I just want to slap myself in the face because, like I said, sincerity is one of the Lord of the Rings trilogy's best attributes. We need to get back to films like these which actually just play it straight. Now look, of course, there are jokes in these movies, but they're never done cheaply. They never undercut a dramatic moment. I mean, the only example I can think of which even comes close to this is Pippin asking where they are going after the Fellowship is formed. But honestly, I think it completely works, because first of all, the line is delivered at the very end of the scene, therefore not undermining any of the drama. And second of all, it's completely in line for his character and the arc he goes on of becoming a more mature person. And here's the thing, man, I'm not completely against this postmodern, self-aware style of storytelling. I think it's something people like Dan Harmon do very well, and obviously characters like Deadpool, it's the whole point of their character. I'm not saying everything needs to be played completely straight, but we definitely seem to have overcorrected in recent times, if that makes sense. I cannot tell you how refreshing it is to watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy in 2024, and to be completely swept up in the emotions, and to not feel like a joke is being played on me, to not feel like every character in the film knows they are in a film, because it gets boring kind of quickly, you know, whereas the more sincere tone of Lord of the Rings, well, it's timeless. I mean, look at one of the most critically and commercially successful films of the past few years, Top Gun Maverick. Why did that movie do so well? Sure, it was well made, you know, Tom Cruise, you can't really go wrong there. But honestly, I think it's just because it was a good film which wore its heart on its sleeve, you know? It was genuine, candid, and to be fair, I do think these types of movies are coming back. We just had Furiosa last month, and Dune Part 2 earlier this year, which I will touch upon more in a bit, as I actually feel like it's this generation's answer to Lord of the Rings. I guess all I'm really saying is that I hope this sincerity can continue to spread back into films, perhaps even into the most mainstream corners of popular cinema. Which brings us to the final and most important reason as to why Lord of the Rings is still undefeated after all these years. It's an obvious one, but it has to be said. Okay, so I wasn't exactly sure how to phrase this one, but it is basically the idea that seemingly every single person who worked on the Lord of the Rings trilogy cared immensely about the project. You know, they all fully bought into Peter Jackson's vision, put their heart and soul into whatever they were doing, but more than that, they actually went beyond what was expected of them, and it really shows in the final product. I cannot think of anywhere better to start in regards to this other than the music. Now look, Howard Shore, he could have, with some effort, composed a solid 8 out of 10 musical score for this trilogy. No one would have questioned it, the guy would have still received a ton of accolades and of course, his paycheck. And I would be sat here right now saying, yeah, Howard Shore, he did a good job on those Hobbit movies. But no. Instead, he decided to compose what is, in my opinion, not just the greatest musical score in the history of film, but one of the best collections of music that you can listen to today. The absolute madman wrote around 130 leitmotifs for The Lord of the Rings. A leitmotif, if you didn't know, are those short melodies you hear in movies which are associated with a particular person, place, or idea. And pretty much all of the ones Howard Shore composed for this trilogy are incredible. There are more memorable tunes in The Lord of the Rings than any other franchise, but what makes them even better is just how well they're integrated into the films, how much they elevate certain moments. The classic example of this is the Fellowship theme, which we hear fragments of throughout the first half of the first movie, almost like Shore is teasing us. But it's only played in its full glory once the Fellowship is assembled, and it's what makes that scene of what is basically just 9 people walking past a rock feel so powerful. Another great example of this is the Rohan theme, which again, throughout the first, maybe third of the 2 towers, is played on a single hardanger fiddle, conveying Rohan's despair and frailty. It is only when Gandalf frees King Theoden and he unsheaths his sword that we hear the theme in all its orchestral glory. Fun fact, this is one of my favourite scenes in film history. But there's just so many examples of this. I'd like to think there was a conversation where Peter Jackson was like, "Hey Howard man, how's it going? Yeah, we're doing this scene where some beacons are set on fire. Basically, can you come up with something? It doesn't need to be anything too crazy, I'm sure you must be very tired by now." And Howard Shore was like, "Yeah, no problem man, I'll send you over the MP3. And then Peter Jackson actually listened to it and just broke down crying because it was one of the greatest pieces of music he'd ever heard. And here's the thing, Howard Shore didn't just swoop in during post-production and smash out the score in a few months, as is often the case these days. No, the guy was involved from the very beginning, seeing the potential of the films and wanting to create something that would stand the test of time. Apparently he would constantly visit the sets, talking to the cast and crew, and of course reading the books while he composed. Almost like he was using Tolkien's writing as a reference, and you can really hear this when listening to the score. You can feel the spirit of the books in every instrument, to the point where I personally will only read the books now while also listening to Shore's musical score. It's become that essential to the Lord of the Rings experience. But here's the thing, man. Everything I've just said about Howard Shore, about his passion and belief and desire to exceed what was expected of him, well, it applies to basically everyone who worked on these movies, you know? I could tell you 100 more stories about so many different members of the cast and crew. From those 2 blokes who spent 2 whole years of their life just linking rings into chainmail, all the way up to the big man himself, Peter Jackson, who in the span of a few years basically went from a director of low-budget, gory horror comedy flicks to the spiritual successor to David Lean. I mean, these 3 movies are so epic in their scope and so well directed. Jackson with this trilogy essentially boils down 100 years of cinematography and camera techniques into 3 movies. It looks bold, it feels inventive, and Jackson strikes a really great balance between practical effects and CGI. Sure, some of the CGI is beginning to date a little, but it's never too jarring because it's usually only there to enhance the incredible practical effects, which of course are never going to age. When you really think about it, it is truly remarkable just how competent everything about the Lord of the Rings trilogy is. There really isn't a weak link throughout the whole thing. There's no performance which is anything less than excellent. Of course, people like Ian McKellen and Bernard Hill, rest in peace, are gonna be amazing. But even someone like Orlando Bloom, who, I'll be honest, I don't think is the greatest actor of all time, even he gets it. Do you know what I mean? He understood the assignment. There were no shortcuts taken throughout this whole trilogy. There was no one on set who didn't take the project fully seriously because it was merely fantasy. And I feel like this universal brilliance which the Lord of the Rings trilogy has, when combined with the sheer respect it has to Tolkien's work, when combined with its pure and wholesome sincerity, well, it creates this true lightning in a bottle kind of feel. The kind of feeling you maybe only get once in a generation. Like I've already said, Dune is the only thing which I feel like has even come close to equaling The Lord of the Rings in terms of a high budget, really well executed, epic story with mainstream appeal. And once again, I think the reason that is that they managed to find the perfect guy to direct the project, someone who was actually passionate and knowledgeable about the original source material, and then they gave him the time and freedom to make something special. Of course, I understand that with all these studios, money is the most important thing. I'm not denying that, but it feels like with Lord of the Rings, and now with Dune, it wasn't the only thing that was on everyone's minds, and I feel like that's the environment you need to make something special. It's why stuff like The Hobbit and The Rings of Power and the Star Wars sequels and a million other things which have been released in the past 20 years just feel so hollow and empty. And look, there may come a time where even the bland, lifeless conveyor belt drivel we get today is seen as art compared to what came next. Or, on the other, more positive side of things, there may come a time where heartfelt, well-made, epic blockbusters come out all the time, where cinemas are filled with passion projects such as Dune or Lord of the Rings. But even if that day does come eventually, something tells me that the Lord of the Rings will always remain undefeated. It's just that good. Thanks for watching.